Thank you so much all for coming, students, and to our guest, Daniel Kosnazarov. Maybe some of you know him because he's someone, a public figure, we could say, in Kazakhstan. So he has experience working in academia as well as in the media. So he's the editor-in-chief of The Step. I think most students know this magazine. If you don't, you should, so look it up. The link was in the email. So very interesting public affairs and society issues that are dealt in this magazine, which is published in many languages, right? So very accessible to the foreign audience as well, because there are articles in English as well. He's with us today. I'm very happy. We meet for the first time, so I'm glad to meet you. He will talk to us about a very interesting chapter that he wrote while he was in residence also that he wrote also as being a resident scholar or research internship. Yesterday, last week we had Sidik Besembayev joining us. So it's really a good program for scholars to get involved into research in this prestigious institution, George Washington University, Central Asia program. And the book is very interesting. The book is in the library, students, if you are interested in the whole book. It's about the Nazarbayev generation. And Daniel Kosnazarov wrote this chapter about hashtag online activism of Kazakhstani youth. So this chapter is about you, students. So enjoy and ask as many questions as you want after his presentation, which I think will last 15-20 minutes if you want, and then we can move on to the Q&A session. So thank you and welcome.
Yes, thanks for hosting me, and such a warm invitation and presentation. I don't want to talk too much, to have it like slightly kind of a lecture thing. I really want to, have some discussion. So maybe I will, briefly, make some points, and then we can proceed to the Q&A session and have some much more interactions with the students, as I'm eager to learn and hear from them very well. So, when I wrote this paper back in January 2019, maybe none of us were really expecting the transition of power happening so fast, and when it happened in March 2019, for many of us, it was a shock. But of course, all these years we were discussing that somehow the transition is going on. So one day the Chas X, as said in Russian, the hour X will happen. Back in 2016, I was invited to work at the library of the first president, which is the Nazarbayev Center now, this beautiful building that is located opposite to the presidential administration. And during that time, actually, we started hearing these rumors, and we were talking with our peers in the office that this would be the exact place where the Nazarbayev would sit when he would, transfer the power to another politicians. So we were actually seeing, even in terms of infrastructure, in terms of physical presence, that there were some preparations for the transition of power. So back in March 2019, when Nazarbayev stepped down, I was in Tokyo giving a lecture about Central Asia and China. So when I heard that, it was I was caught myself thinking that, oh my God, we're living in a very historical time. So I would be, and the next generation would be the first generation that would feel this whole particular moment as the youth, and then afterwards it will try to live with that. So when we look to the generation theory, the basic premise, the basic idea of this theory is that generations are not those who were born in one year or within the same cohort. It is the people who are facing similar disasters or political crises or huge events like pandemics, for example. So the transition of power and the shift of power from Nazarbayev to another person, and the whole system change that we're seeing now with Tokayev and parliamentary elections are coming, we see that this is the historic moment that shapes the very consciousness of the new generations that are going to live with that and going to, you know, develop some strategies, survival strategies afterwards. So this is the very important moment that we have to bear in mind when we talk about the generations of Kazakhstan. But you know, when you read a lot of papers in media outlets, particularly in Western media outlets, you are really getting confused of who is millennials, who is baby boomers, who is the Generation Z, and there's a lot of kind of qualities that are being prescribed to them, a lot of features that are being prescribed to them, and this forms a particular problem because generation theory is become a all-exclusive kind of concept that tries to fit in all of the different features. For example, when we talk about millennials, some writers or some authors are saying that this is the most vulnerable generation. But some of them are saying that no, they are very aspiring, very progressive. They try to change the world, and they for example, want to have a mission of the company. So it would be very attractive to them to join the, you know, the employer if the company has a mission, for example. So we have all these controversial kind of ideas floating about the generations. And this means that we have to be very dangerous when we talk about which generations this particular we are talking about or discussing. But when we look to the Kazakhstan, there are three important generations that are, you know, living nowadays, that are striving nowadays. First generation is those who were born, raised, and lived a larger part of their life in the Soviet Union. The second generation, and particularly millennials, were born in the Soviet Union, but were raised and lived the entire life in the independent Kazakhstan. And then there is the last generation, which is the post-millennials or Generation Z, which were born, raised, and now live in independent Kazakhstan. So I think this particular divisions is much more, you know, useful and applicable to Kazakhstan rather than dividing them to baby boomers or millennials or Generation Z. It is much more, I think, much more specifically applied to the Kazakhstan. But the very important political feature of Kazakhstan is that the political system co-opts all the different generations. So it doesn't matter, are you a millennial, are you a baby boomer or a Gen Z? If you want to be part of the system, if you want to work in the in this particular public administration, you have to have you have to abide to political rules of the system. So when we talk about, for example, the generation of the 70s, which is Baurjan Baybek, for example, the head of the Nur Otan party, or Yerlan Karin, the associate of Tokayev, or, for example, Dauren Abayev, or Aida Balayeva, or some other figures like Aset Isikeshev, all of them were born in the 70s, and you know, they were raised in the Soviet Union. But some of the authors are trying to say that the new faces are coming, but it's not how it works. All of these people, even if they are younger than Nazarbayev or Tasmagambetov or some other political figures, they are actually part of this political system, and they have been assimilated by this political system. So this means that in such an authoritarian context, actually many generational divisions are not working very well. So we have to have a structural kind of analysis when we talk about how generations theory are working in this particular countries. And the other thing is that when we talk about Kazakhstan, and when we try to analyze the generations, the youth in particular, we have to look to their parents first of all, because they are those who are transmitting all those values. Even though many, you know, Western articles are saying that each particular generation is unique and extraordinary and original, in such a collectivist societies, even if we have, you know, individualism is developing in many big cities like Almaty and Astana, there's still a lot of collectivist kind of culture are still there. So when we want to analyze what are the values of the new generations, first we have to look what are the values of the whole entire society, the whole entire Kazakh society. So when we see that there are a lot of conservative values, they are also transmitting to the new generation. So we also have to look to the parents and to the older generation to analyze what are the real values that are the case in Kazakhstan or some other, you know, Central Asian countries. So this has the kind of, you know, the wider context that is important when you try to use the generation theory. So I'm really inviting you to be very cautious when you try to apply this kind of theory in this particular, you know, Kazakhstani context. But the other and very important thing is that, and I don't have an answer for that, why, for example, in Belarus, in Kyrgyzstan, you know, particularly with the recent situation there, we have a much more active youth compared to the Kazakhstan. And why, particularly in Kyrgyzstan, we have, you know, political revolts that are being successful, you know, in terms of changing of the generations in power. But in Kazakhstan and Belarus, you know, when you look to these recent cases, there are still a lot of inertia and the status quo is still, you know, going on. So I think it would be really interesting to analyze the very system, the very context, and the very institutional kind of base we have in Belarus, in Kyrgyzstan, in Kazakhstan, and in Russia, when we try to apply the youth and older generation kind of clash that is being there, particularly in Belarus and Kyrgyzstan. So this is another important aspect. If you want to look for that, I will be really helpful, you know, to do something with you, to have a research and so on. And when to turn to a particular article, you know, to hashtag activism, you know, some of my friends said to me, you know, your article was actually predicting the creation of the Oyan Kazakhstan movement. And Leila, I think later, you know, during the next week, we'll talk about this as well. But actually, the creation of the Oyan Kazakhstan, we also need to look for the creation and the origins of such protest movements as Oyan Kazakhstan. When we look to the Safe Kokzhailao movement or feminist activism, particularly in Almaty, you know, the activists from Kasfem, Feminita, for example, they actually laid the foundation of the Oyan Kazakhstan, and the success of the Safe Kokzhailao environmental movement was actually a pretext for such a movement to appear and to have a lot of vibe and a lot of hype about the, you know, about the youth protests. So we also, I mean, this article, my article, particularly explains the roots of this movement, and we see some kind of logic and continuity in this. But actually, the very occurrence of the Oyan Kazakhstan actually changes the dimension of the youth protests. So we have to look again to the, and we have to study again the youth protests in Kazakhstan by looking into what the Oyan Kazakhstan has done. So there is, you know, actually some of my findings have changed after the transition and after the Oyan Kazakhstan movement has appeared. So in this regard, we actually need a new reevaluation and a new reflection upon what is the youth protest and youth social movements in Kazakhstan with this new particular political situation with the transition of power. And my last point, and which is very important, and I really be interested in doing a research about that, is that in Kazakhstan, during all these 30 years, we have two competing discourses about the youth that have been always there. The first discourse is that, you know, the Kazakh youth is the positive agents of change. This is what usually government says, by creating Jasotan, by creating some, university movements, by inviting the youth to attend some political events. When particularly President Nazarbayev wins some election, you can see a lot of youth, around and, waving the flags, being proud and saying that, the youth supports me. So this is one discourse. The second discourse is that a youth is a threat to the political stability of Kazakhstan. And this particular discourse had been, amplified after the Arab Spring and color revolutions that have been there in 2004, 2005 in Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, and, Ukraine and some other countries. So we have these two competing discourses that are, doesn't clearly define what is the youth in Kazakhstan in terms of the official discourse, because official discourse is trying to use all these two discourses, and when they see non-systemic youth like Oyan Kazakhstan that are not joining Jasotan party, for example, they usually blame them as a threat, label them as hipsters, label them as the lazy Almaty creative class, young youth that are, only sitting in cafes and doing nothing. So we have these two discourses being manipulated by the officials in the favor of keeping their own regime security. So I think this would be a very interesting topic to explore. And if you want to study or, make some, explorations about this topic, I will be really happy to, join and, have some contributions. So this is what I have in my mind today.
Thank you so much. If we were in class, we would clap, right? How about we can clap virtually, right? So students clap, please. You see, clapping. We have a session now, a question. You can ask them in the chat if you want. Tomidis already posted her question. You can ask them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and ask them in person. We don't have that many students, so it would not be chaotic. So if you want to ask it with your camera on or without your camera, but with your own voice, you can do it. I will give you the floor. Or if you want to ask a private question, you can send me a private message in the chat and I'll ask it on your behalf. So this is how we can proceed. We'll start with Tomidis. Maybe I will read her question. And then we have Nazarke, she raised her hand. So Nazarke, you next. Okay, Danya, thank you for this chapter. The topic is of great interest to me. I'm studying the Almaty Air petition by Asiya Tulesava with another professor. Very good, Tomidis. And I'm writing a capstone project on online activism on ending Uyghur forced labor. It's notable that Kazakh activists choose petitions probably because it's a safe way of protest. My question is, do you think that hashtag activism will ever turn into real collective action in Kazakhstan? And when and under which condition that could happen? Thanks.
Yes, thanks for the question. It's a really interesting one. I think it's really difficult to, have this causality of online activism and how it translates into a kind of, offline activism. It's still difficult to prove, I suppose, in terms of, kind of having this scientific causality relations. But I think, the social media in particular is important in making people, adjust and being used to voicing their concerns and being in the public and writing something and signing petitions by saying that I'm against of that law, or I want to change something in my country or in Almaty town, for example, with the environment problem, as you know, is very critical. With the air pollution is very critical. So I think social media activism has to play a certain role in converting the hashtag activism into an offline activism. But as we see in Kazakhstan, I think, for example, recently, like a year ago, there was a protest in Astana of the mothers who have a lot of children. And they were not, you know, protesting in WhatsApp or Facebook or Instagram. They were directly, you know, going to the streets, going to Nuratan or going to a, you know, to a hall, to different halls. So there is a lot of actually audiences and a lot of publics in Kazakhstan, within Kazakhstan, that are using different strategies. So we also have to identify what particular audience are we talking about. The youth, of course, they are more, you know, used to use Instagram or Facebook to voice their concerns, and not, you know, not being in the streets with the transparency, with the, you know, mass demonstrations and so on. But I think in the longer term, it also can play a big, you know, catalyst role in turning this online activism into an offline activism. But we really have to study this. We really have to look how this will go. But particular silence about the Uyghurs from the youth, from the Almaty youth, from the, you know, liberal youth, is very intriguing and is very interesting, because many Kazakh nationalists are actually is much more aggressive in that. If you know Jambolat Mamai, who is like 35 or 40 years old, he's very vocal in this particular topic, and he is inviting many many protesters to, you know, to join his cause and going to offline, for example, streets. So it's really important to analyze what particular audience you're analyzing, and what are their strategies.
Yeah, that's very interesting to see that they are different communities of protesters. Yeah, so more nationalist, more traditional people, and very liberal, like you say, Almaty youth. Yeah, so maybe we'll come back on this later. Nazarke, can you turn on your microphone yourself?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay, sure. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much for the lecture. It was very interesting. I have two questions. So the first one is, do you believe that there are young people who genuinely support the establishment? And if yes, what are the reasons for that?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, the youth is not a monolithic kind of monolithic concept. And what really annoys me when we talk about the youth of Kazakhstan, when you look to the general definition, it is the youth that are between 14 and 29 years old. This is the kind of official definition of the youth. And when you look to the generational differences, you can see definitely the difference between the 14 years old teenager and the 29 years old millennial who are working, you know, in the services industry or some other, you know, some other job. So this particular concept of the youth is very generalizing, and it doesn't really specify the needs of each particular group within the whole you know, within the whole youth kind of matrix. And of course, we have a lot of youth that are working in the public sector, that are trying to have a very good political career. And recent, you know, 100 new faces kind of programs, or Yale UMT programs, or Tokayev 300 reserve people, youth reserve, something like that, is actually showing that some of the youth are really investing their energy and power to be co-opted by the system and to have a political career, particularly in this system. So many of the youth in the public administration are actually seeing Tokayev as the new face that could co-opt them as talented youth, as a loyal youth, so they could make a career there. So some of them are actually having a calculus that with the Nazarbayev generation, all the people would go and I would fill this vacuum and I would become the new face of the Tokayev regime, and so on and so forth. So we have really different audiences and different society, different people within the youth as well. So we also have to look to them when we analyze what is Kazakhstan, what is the real Kazakh youth, and so on.
Yeah, thank you. It's very interesting trend that you just pointed out. And I also have a second question, which is a bit longer. So some scholars point out that the ways with which autocratic countries control information in the media has changed. So if before the Soviet state had a monopoly of information and they could like easily block and prevent people from knowing, now the state just, it doesn't block anything, but it chooses to flood the digital space with so much news and information so that the people's attention gets shifted from like serious problematic issues. Do you think, do you agree that with the statement? And if yes, are there like any ways to avoid that trap?
Well, it's a very interesting question how authoritarian states are using social media and adapting to the new environment, you know, to the 21st century that we live in. And I think there is a good article written by Sergei Guriev on digital autocracies. You can Google it and read. I mean, he has a lot of very interesting insights. But when we look to Kazakhstan, I think the social media in particular and the Facebook in particular is becoming one of the vulnerabilities that Kazakh government has created itself. It actually monitors the Facebook and other social media to see what are the people thinking about some particular political issues, or do they have a protest kind of feelings about some of the laws or so on and so forth. So when the government actually blocks the internet, blocks the YouTube or blocks the Facebooks, it actually cuts the communication channel, because it doesn't have any other effective measurement tools to see what are the people thinking about particular issues. So that is why it actually created this particular dilemma for itself. On the one hand, it wants to control the Facebook, YouTube, and some other, you know, social media platforms. But on the other hand, if it blocks it a lot, it actually doesn't know what will be the real feelings of the public on the ground. But the other reality is also there. For example, when you see too many, you know, particularly nationalist voices, those who were for example, in Karaganda, when the Armenian Kazakh clashes were there, or, you know, the recent event, there was one in near the Kordai, you know, when the Dungan Kazakh clash was there, you know. All of them are not sitting on Facebook, are not posting something on YouTube or Instagram. They were actually mobilizing by the WhatsApp. And the WhatsApp is actually one of the really, you cannot control WhatsApp as Facebook. You don't have troll bots, troll farms, or bots like you can see in Facebook, for example. So it's much more difficult to control all those people who are not sitting on Facebook or Instagram. So in this perspective, we also have different societies, different stratas that are using different strategies of mobilization. Someone is using WhatsApp, someone is using Instagram or Facebook. So it is really difficult for the government to control all of them effectively.
Thank you. Very interesting. We have a question from Jasmine. She's my special guest, an outsider. She's not a student in class. Jasmine Daniela. She's on the menu next week in the semester. Next week in the syllabus. So her question is, Dania, I really enjoyed your chapter, and I think it illustrates well how Kazakh youth use the internet and are politically active. What were your thoughts on the chapter by Yunisbay? Yunisbay, we also received Barbara Yunisbay earlier this semester in the same volume. The students have not read this article about the the Nazarbayev generation, political thoughts, political views. So because they actually paint a rather negative picture of Kazakhstan, of the Kazakhstani youth. I was actually having the exact same question. What were your reactions on this? Because to summarize very quickly, so basically the chapter, I mean, based on polls, surveys that they conducted, they say that the Nazarbayev generation is less politicized, not very interested in engaging in political activities, and are actually more conservative than their parents, economically conservative and politically conservative. So that's a very surprising finding, and yeah, it doesn't paint a exactly pristine picture of the Kazakhstani youth. So yeah, I would like to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Well, I really agree on that, and I'm not kind of in my article or in my thoughts. I'm not juxtaposing my view with Junuspai, with Azamat's views. You know, when I had conducted this poll back in 2017, you know, I also find out that the youth is very conservative and they are not that politically active as supposed to be. The real political mobilization of the Kazakh youth or Kazakh population are happening after 30, 35 years old, when, you know, when many of the citizens are forming their own family, started to have a job, and, you know, paying for the credits, for the mortgages and so on. So the real trigger for the mobilization of the population in Kazakhstan is the real economic problems, as we see with the mothers. And when you look to the mothers, most of them were in their 30s or 40s. And the youth generally in Kazakhstan is very comfortable with their living. It has a lot of, you know, similarities with the global youth, with Generation Z across the world. Most of them are, you know, having masters, having bachelor degree. Most of them doesn't work when they, you know, study in the university, and most of them are not that interested in politics because actually they are being, most of the time, they are being protected by the parents. You know, in the US, we have this concept of helicopter parenting. We have the similar problem, the similar situation here in Kazakhstan. And the reason for that is that, one of the main reasons for that is that, and I say about this in my article, we have the syndrome of the 90s. Many of the parents were traumatized by the 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed, and when they were actually were very hungry. There were no jobs, and many of the, you know, professors and teachers have left their jobs in the universities and started to sell goods in the markets, going to China and sell the cheap goods here in bazaars and so on and so forth. So many of the parents are still kind of, as I have said, traumatized by this experience, and they really want their children to become much more successful. So they are trying to do everything as possible to, you know, make their children strive. So it has created a lot of over-parenting, actually, and it doesn't really help the youth being much more active, being much more experienced in their life, being much more, you know, taking the responsibility for themselves. So I think this is one of the particular reasons why the youth is really inactive. And in that perspective, it's a global trend. It doesn't only apply for Kazakhstan or other Central Asian countries. So we have to change our discourse, our thinking, because usually we have this dominant discourse of the 86 youth in France, or, you know, hippie generation in the US, when the active youth in France, in French universities, were actually protesting and, you know, having all these marches all along all these, you know, in many cities and so on. This trend is changing, and the youth is becoming very active when they're becoming older. So this is the point we need to consider when we talk about the youth activism.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Something I had not thought about. That, yeah, because I mean, you don't protest when you don't have any problems, right? And you start having problems when you become financially independent, and then you face, yeah, many different issues with the job market or your finances. Yeah, that's very interesting. But if I may say so, if I might add something, coming from a North American background, I see differences though in the youth being, I would say, a bit more independent from their parents here in North America. I was a bit surprised when I arrived here to how present the parents were in the students' psyche, kind of. Students always talk about their parents, which is something that is really a contrast with North Americans, for instance, whose parents are involved in their lives, but not to the extent that we see in Central Asia, even in Kazakhstan. So that's very interesting to see that. I see that Diaz has a question and Tomires has another one. But yeah, when you said something about a generation is not based on the year of your birth, but it's about experiences. And even if you're born in that particular era, the values of the societies are forming you as well. So I was wondering if, so you're saying that parents, have a great influence on their political thought of their children. So is Kazakhstan stuck on a path dependency of social politically? I mean, you don't have to answer that, but this was just one of the questions. So is change actually possible, given the current situation? But I don't want to take too much time. Maybe I'll let the students ask their questions. This is for them, right? So Diaz, you're next. You can ask a question, please.
I actually feel bad for taking your time to ask the question, but anyway, Daniel, thank you very much for your lecture, and I wanted to ask you about your paper, a question related to your paper. So in your paper, you write that the underlying assumption of your paper is that the development of the Kazakhstan will depend on to what extent the government is prepared to adapt to changes. So we can certainly say that the extent to which government is ready to just to meet the demands of the society, I guess it increased starting from the resignation of Nazarbayev in 2019. So what do you think are the boundaries now? Like how far can the society go in their demands? Like what are the boundaries at the moment? Thank you.
Thank you, Diaz. It's nice to hear from you. Diaz is an intern in the STEP, so he wrote a lot of articles for our media outlets. So I'm happy to hear your question. Well, I think I think government tries to adapt, but it's very it's not that effective as we want, as the society wants. For example, this Natsovet, the Council of the National Confidence, right? Доверие, Национальный совет общественного доверия, that has been created during Tokayev with Yerlan Karin's ideas. So one of the amendments to the law was to include the youth and the women as the quota, for political parties. So I think, they're trying to react and they're trying to have some cosmetic kind of reforms, but it's not enough, and it's very. They're trying to play the society, but I think it's not that effective and satisfactory. But in this regard, I also see some stagnation and some passivity from the youth, from Oyan Kazakhstan, for example. They had started very well, but now with pandemics, probably most of the voices are, they're trying to be, low profile. Of course, many of them doesn't want to, have some problems with the security agencies, as KMB, for example, and I understand that. I work as the editor-in-chief, and I also, during the protest, I had a lot of calls, actually, from many agencies of Kazakhstan and from the presidential administration, for example, to change some of the messages or tones of the article. So we also have to deal with that when we are trying to, be public and trying to voice our concerns. So of course, it affects a lot how we behave, what we are saying, and there's also this concept of the auto-censorship that is still important in authoritarian context. So of course, all of this matters, and we also have to consider all of these, variables when we talk about how the youth is trying to navigate in all this difficult state apparatus kind of centric system that is very repressive, still very repressive, and is very aggressive about the public concerns. We also need to analyze and see what will be the outcomes of the parliamentary elections that are going to have on January 2021, because there is now this idea floating that let's organize online elections. Everyone would be in lockdown and everyone would vote via app or some website. So maybe there is this concern of not having avoiding the Belarus or Kyrgyz kind of scenarios by launching the online elections, for example. I think we also need to see what will be the social dynamics after the parliamentary elections and what would be the scenarios of transition, because transition is not ended. Actually, my take is that after the parliamentary elections, Baybek would become a prime minister, and actually there would be serious changes in the law, and Tokayev would become just a symbolic president, and all the leverages, all the political leverages would go to the parliament, and they will control the cabinet, and they will control many security agencies, Ministry of Defense, KMB, and some other important силовые структуры. So we also need to see how the dynamics would go and what will be the response of the society, particularly after the pandemics, because in Kyrgyzstan and Belarus, how the government responded was a very important trigger of many clashes and many public concerns.
Thank you. I have actually posted a link in the chat. It's Erlan Karin is defending the Nastaviet Etani talk show. So if you want, I actually meant to send it to the students soon, so it was a good opportunity. Yeah, so
I want to add that, I'm sorry, Erlan Karin was in our marriage back in 2014, and we are talking with him every time, and in WhatsApp, and sometimes he consults with me and collects some ideas about how Natsavet is working. So if you have some ideas of reforming Natsavet, please tell me. I'll be happy to deliver your thoughts and affect the decision making as well.
Ah, you see, the students, you can have a say in the circles of power. Use this opportunity. Familiarize yourself with the Soviet, and then share your thoughts. We have another question from Tamiris. In the chapter, you mentioned that, for instance, created of Le Chapalak and Zanami Uji Uyekhali never participated in political campaigns. Do you think online political activism, or rather selectivism, will actually result in any political changes in the system? Thanks.
Do you know that the founder of Le Chapalak is the graduate of the Nazarbayev University?
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, I'm also following him on Insta. I really like his stuff. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's really good that with your critical thinking and creative thinking, actually, that Nazarbayev University instills to the youth, they are opening such a very important social media projects as Le Chapalak. Well, it's a very tricky question, and as I have said before, I think online activism could play a very important role, a trigger to make people get used to a offline activism. And I think that with the government being very addicted to the social media, I think they're also monitoring very well what our people are thinking. So this could be also a very important strategy to make and to use when you're trying to have some political changes. But I think you have to combine actually political online and offline activism to make it much more effective, much more advocacy-like important. Mm-hmm.
Other questions, students? No? No more questions? Yeah, Slamjar is asking. Slamjar, he's our TA. He's a PhD student in the Graduate School of Public Policy. Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. You spoke about politicians such as Baybek, Balayeva, Sekeshev, and others who were born in the 1970s, and they absorbed the values of Soviet-style administration. Does that mean that newcomers to public admin have to play by old rules and maintain the status quo? Is there a possibility for a change that is driven by the new blood in public administration? So are you asking about your future, Slamjat?
Well, I actually worked as Helen, as you have said before the presentation, I have worked in the government think tank. So I wrote, policy briefs for the president when I was working in the Nazarbayev Center. And some of the policy briefs were, actually discussed seriously in the Security Council. And one of the papers I wrote was back in 2014 when the ISIS has formed and everyone was discussing ISIS in Syria. And there were this scenario of the spillover effect to Afghanistan. So there was a serious discussion in the Security Council of this particular scenario. And I wrote a paper on that. And some of the decisions were made that paper. And actually, when I was working there, I was very optimistic and idealistic that I could change the system inside, by working within the government. And I actually figured out that you have much more opportunities when you are considered or seen as an insider rather than the outsider. So when many political experts and pundits are trying to affect the public discourse about particular political situations, many of them are not considered that well. But when you are working inside and when you are writing a policy brief to a decision maker in presidential administration, actually you have much more chances to have some shift in his thinking. But the nature of many political analysis there is very cosmetic, I would say. It is not about proposing a dramatic shift or a revolutionary kind of change about the political system. It is rather about keeping the status quo and make some minor changes, or propose some ideas, bright ideas, or fishki, as said in Russian, to decision makers. And after working there for 2 years, I figured out that, of course, you can change something when you're an insider, but they would not, you cannot make some dramatic revolutionary changes when you are there. So this was one of the decisions that I left the public service and went to a private sector.
I'm still mute. Okay, another question from Tamiris. Adding to Slamjar's note, it seems to me that there is enough youth currently in Gest and Arotan who learn from the old generation, and it feels like a vicious circle. And as Daniel said, only those are allowed to the closed circle. Nuratan, Gest and Nuratan. If I can add something like this, this is quite interesting to me to see that, Nuratan is extremely dominating, in the political environment in Kazakhstan, but are there, it's like a bit like bipartisan in the United States or in Canada. You see like very large parties that regroup a lot of different people, because they're so big that they have to accommodate, they have to be very centrist. The Republican Party is not very centrist at the moment in the United States, but Nuratan seems to be very centrist, and it's a huge organization. And do you have, I don't think you have worked for the party, but are you aware of different like factions within the party? Are there very ideological clashes within the party? There are new ideas coming up that clash with like old ideas. If you could comment on that.
Well, it's a good question. You probably know Sayasat Nurbek, who worked for the Nuratan party. He was the head of the director of the School of Management or something like that. And when he worked there, I was actually visiting several times the headquarters of Nuratan, to talk and have some discussions about the changes and what kind of ideas he would apply or use when he would when he's there. But actually, I mean, it is still a very person-centric kind of institution, and many of the activities or the public performance would be really based on who is there ruling the party, who is the deputy director of Nuratan, because the председатель, the chair of the Nuratan is Nazarbayev, is still Nazarbayev, but the second person is always changing. And now Baybek is, trying to shape the Nuratan party as much as possible for his own interests. And, this parliamentary election particularly would show who is loyal to him and who would take the parliamentary seats. And I mean, it also shows his own political ambitions.
Mm-hmm.
I also mentioned, for example, Irlan Kari. He was the secretary of Nuratan back in 2013 or 2014, something like that. He was also working for, I don't know who was the deputy director there, but there was also a very different style. And when the new political figure comes, he always wants to make headlines. He always wants to voice some new reforms and show that in his hands the political party is in the right hands, or so on. But the real thing is that they are not working for the society. The real interests that are trying to the real appealing power that are trying to gain is for the president, Nazarbayev. So all of the PR and all of the marketing strategy of the political parties, particularly Nuratan in Kazakhstan, is about appealing to the feelings of Nazarbayev, and this situation is still there. So if it would not change, the real reform of political parties is a fake.
Yeah, what I find interesting is that when I started studying comparative politics as a MA student, what is the definition of democracy, right? So you have competition and alternates, right? And we always took the example of the USSR, saying that in the USSR there was a lot of mobilization and participation through the Communist Party, but there was no competition. Right, so it had only one of the elements. So what I find interesting is that Nuratan is a bit like that. There's a lot of mobilization. It's a huge organization that mobilizes a lot of people, but there is no competition. Yeah, so that's really interesting. And you're saying that even within the party, there's not a lot of competition, right? So or challenge, not a lot of challenges to authority. But you could say that this is a bit of a Soviet legacy of the Soviet political system.
About the mobilization, I also want to share some experience that happened to myself when I was, in Nazarbayev Center. There were elections in 2016, I suppose, of the last presidential elections or parliamentary or something. I don't remember precisely. Before the official results were announced, 2 days before the official results, there were Nuratan preparations in this particular building. So I mean, the Nuratan and Jasotan were preparing for the victory, even if there were no official polls there. Yeah. So I think it clearly shows that the political party and Nuratan is a real mobilization force to show that people are supporting the policy of Nazarbayev, the first president, and so on. And it plays a very technical role of organizational role of mobilizing people to show that everyone is supporting the course, the official political course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. Diaz has a question. Maybe I guess it will be a last question because it's already been almost an hour. Diaz, you have the last question.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry for asking the second question, but I actually got interested in when he said about buyback and yeah, like every time the deputy chairman of the Nurotan comes, like they declare something new. But don't you feel that buyback like declared like especially strongly, like primaries, 50,000 to get to every family, like from my name, and he was staging it like so. How do you assess his attempts to reorganize the party and to reshape it under his own name?
Well, actually, my assessment is that, as I have said, Bybek is actually a competitor against Tokayev in this transition process, which is still continuing, which is still going on. And we really have to look to the, as I have said, to the results of the parliamentary elections and how the political system would change after the serious law amendments. I think that Tokayev would not be elected as the next president after 7 years or how many years. So the real successor of Nazarbayev would be Bybek. So that is why, particularly during the pandemics, he has created a lot of controversial anti-Tokayev kind of policy messages to show that he is the real competitor against the president, the second president of Kazakhstan. So I think we have to look to that.
Interesting. All right, I think, yeah, it's all an hour on the dot. So I want to thank you so much. It was very interesting, very engaging. I learned a lot as well. And I still have so much to learn about Kazakhstani politics, but this was very helpful. I'm sure our students also enjoyed it. Students, you can clap. Yes, thumbs up, clap. It's always good. Oh, somebody's trying to join. Too late. So yeah, thank you so much. I hope that this is not the last time that we will see you in class, and thank you again. And I guess students can reach out to you if they have questions.
It's a great pleasure, and if you have questions or you have ideas for collaboration, please write me on Facebook or Instagram. I would be happy to reply and help you out.
Thank you so much. All right. Have a good day, everyone. Good evening. Yeah, to me, it's the beginning of the day, but have a good evening, everyone. Goodbye.